Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome Nick to be our speaker tonight. Nick's been involved with all our visits to Spain since our first exploratory visit in 2012 and has become not only a member, but a good personal friend and friend of the Society. Just a little diversion before he starts. As you may obviously understand, there are an enormous range of languages into which Orwell's works have been translated. During this week, we had an email from a gentleman in Iceland who is translating Homage at the moment. And you see the gentleman with sort of roll neck jersey and cap next to the gentleman with the Sam Brown belt. He asked me whether that was actually my father. I had to disappoint him, although he is also clearly of reasonable girth. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Quentin and Chris, and thanks so much everyone for coming. Okay, so I've entitled this George Orwell's Barcelona, and we're there basically a tour really around the places he visited and the things he came upon. I also have a quick trip to Aragon as well, although we won't have time to do a proper visit around his time in Aragon today. Of course, Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is almost certainly not only the most widely read book about the memoir about the Spanish Civil War, it's probably the most widely read book, full stop, about the Spanish Civil War, which in a way is somewhat problematic because, of course, it's not a history book and it was never intended to be a history book. It's a memoir, that's a different thing. And perhaps a problem is that people who don't read anything else about the Spanish Civil War read Orwell's book, and this is not what he intended, and take it as a history of the war. The war is so much more complex, it's so much bigger. Orwell was there for 6 months, the war was 2.5 years, Orwell was in Barcelona and a small part of Aragon. The Spanish Civil War was geographically so much bigger, etc., etc. But it's still there. It's such a superb memoir of the war. And of course, the lessons that he takes from it lead him directly, I think, to write 1984. But if we have time, we'll come on to that. You can also argue, people have said that it's actually not a very good title because Homage to Catalonia isn't really about Catalonia at all. It's about his time in Barcelona and his time in Aragon, but it has a certain ring to it, though, doesn't it? Okay, moving on. So we'll talk about this photograph, the only photograph we have proven of Orwell in Barcelona. There's another one proven in Aragon, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So he becomes aware of the war, presumably very quickly because he reads the press. July, the war begins between the 17th and 19th of July, 1936, and of course it's already reflected in his writings. Which, of course, he's writing The Road to Wigan Pier by the autumn of 36, and we have this sentence there which you can all see. So he's already becoming very clear about it. And at some point in the autumn of 36, like many people around the world, he decides to come to Spain. There's all this debate about why does he come, because in his book he claims that he comes with this vague idea of doing some journalism and he gets caught up in it. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's also, but there's also quite a lot of evidence he actually directly comes to fight. But it was probably a bit of both, and perhaps we'll never know directly why. So he tries first to get, because he thinks he needs permission from an anti-fascist party to come to Spain, which is not strictly true. And the logical method of entering Spain is through the international brigades, which were organised by the Comité, Communist International. So he has a meeting in London, mid-December 1936, with the Communist Party leader, Harry Pollitt. By the way, the reason I'm going fast is because I've got a feeling that I've got an awful lot of things to say in 45 minutes. And maybe I'm going a bit fast. So he has a meeting with Harry Pollitt, who famously, of course, rejects him. Pollitt claims later that he rejected Orwell because he was repelled by his old Etonian accent. I don't buy that at all, because we have to think that Harry Pollitt happily accepted other public school boys into the international brigades. And I think it was clearly Orwell already had a reputation for, slightly contrarian leftist ideas. He'd been associated with the Independent Labour Party. He'd written some articles for, is it New Leader, the magazine?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, he didn't trust his politics, and that's clearly why he's rejected. So as a secondary option, he, via his contacts and Eileen's contacts as well, with the Independent Labour Party. Independent Labour Party was a left socialist breakaway from the Labour Party in Britain, which had, as we'll see, was a sister organisation, more or less, with the Marxist PUM in Barcelona. And they're organising, as the international brigade, the communists have organised their international brigades. Well, they're organising their own little international brigade from Britain, which becomes known as the ILP contingent. In the end, it's only approximately 30 go, but so he arranges to go with them. They're supposed to be going in January, but he gets he wants to go early, and he leaves on around, I think it's the 23rd of December 1936 from London. By the way, this ambulance, Joaquim Maurin, this is named after the initial leader of the PUM, who was imprisoned by the Franco regime under a false identity. They didn't know who he was, or he would have been shot. And he actually survives the war, but that's actually memory of this. And we'll see later the sanatorium, the hospital where he stays in Barcelona, and when he's curing his neck, is also named after Joaquim Maurin. So so he's leaving on the 23rd, leaves London, stops off famously in Paris, has lunch with Henry Miller, who thinks he's an idiot, he's coming to fight for socialism. But as a fellow artist, he gives Orwell his corduroy jacket. It's supposed that Orwell wears this on the Aragon front, although I don't see any reference to it in any of his writings. But anyway, I'm sure a talk about Henry Miller and Orwell would be an interesting one, which I know very little about. So anyway, he then gets on another train, which is effectively the famous the Red Express, which left most nights. It was nicknamed the Red Express from Paris down to Spain, where international brigades typically took the train from there as well. He writes about this quite movingly in the As I Please article, which we won't go into, but if you haven't read it, it's a really good piece of subsequent writing to read after Homage Catalonia. I think the thing about this article and his journey, though, is interesting, is that he's meeting on the train, people from all around the world, Czechs, Germans, Frenchmen, he says, and all around Europe. And we have to, and as the train's going through the south of France, people are saluting it in the stations. Every field, he says, is a French peasant saluting the train, because we've got to realize is, by 1936, there's directly a fascist Europe, but there's also a growing consciousness of anti-fascist one, and that train and others is representing very much the anti-fascist side. And I think, above all, that's why Orwell's coming. It's anti-fascism. So he's crossing France. He crosses the border on the 26th of December 36 and arrives in Barcelona. He gets off the Estació de França, which is about there. By the way, you see that we'll see the name Plaça George Orwell on this map. Plaça George Orwell has got really nothing to do with Orwell's time in Barcelona. It was created in the 1990s by the city council, who wanted to open up a bit of space in the old quarter, and they named it after him. I forgot to put an image in, actually, but it's famous actually because it's locally, people don't tend to call it Plaça George Orwell. They call it Plaça del Tripi. Tripi means drugs in Catalan. And it's actually the first place in Spain, I'm not making this up, so you'll know this, the first place in Spain to have a CCTV camera, George Orwell Square, which is quite fitting, really, but because of the drug dealers. So he goes along here, he's paraded along the front, although he doesn't mention it almost certainly, as all brigaders typically were. The International, they're hearing the anarchist anthem, a las barricadas, they're hearing the French anthem. very much associated at the time with the left, and hits the bottom of the Ramblers and starts walking up the Ramblers, and he is stunned by what he sees and writes his famous words, which we're going to come on to. And he says it's the first time he'd been in a town, in a city in which the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been draped in red flags and red and black flags of the anarchists, and the working class appear to have taken over. And we need to stop now for a moment and go back and give some context of why. So, Orwell walks into this, but what's the context? Why has Barcelona been taken over by the working class? Well, we have to see it apart from the context of the terrible differences between rich and poor in Barcelona pre-war and the terrible tensions there were, it's also in the context of how the military was coup defeated in Barcelona on the 19th of July 1936. And when the military leave the barracks in the morning of the 19th of July, the fascist military, if you want to call them that, they are defeated by a combination of worker and police resistance. But in this process of a day and a half, 600 people are killed, of defeating the military, on the Sunday night, the workers, principally anarchists, storm the major barracks of Barcelona with the help of soldiers who say, yeah, come in. And they get hold of around 30,000 weapons. They're old in the main, but they're weapons. It's enough to control a city. And they drive around the working class districts and hand them out, more or less to anyone who insists. And suddenly it's the working class who are in control. They got the arms. And the anger of this, and then suddenly the power they have invested in these arms, and the Catalan police are exhausted. They no longer have the monopoly of violence. Power of this allows, we've got this is sort of an image is there of initially it's the workers and the police are all together. This is a curious one because you've got the symbol, the CNT is the anarchist trade union. We've got the symbol of the Liberal Republic, which are actually two disparate images, two disparate visions, but them initially are all together. The police and workers there together. These presumably may well have been enemies a few days before. But the power that the working class certainly has through these arms and the anger unleashed by the coup, because I'd argue that most of Barcelona's working class probably would have accepted the reforming project of the Republic, as they did in the United Kingdom. But now the rules of the game have changed, and they think if we can't have schools and education and progress, in that way, liberal democratic way, well, we're going to do it ourselves and let's say take advantage of the situation. And they start to take over their workplace. I'll come back to that. Just as a quick revision of this. I'm sure most of you know this, but just in case, I think all Homage to Catalonia editions perhaps should begin with this a table like this, but dividing organizations into two, those in favor of a working class anti-capitalist revolution, some form of socialist revolution, and those in favor of maintaining the liberal democratic republic. We've got the anarchists, the CNT, biggest trade union in Barcelona, dominated the working class city. We got the PUM, who we know are anti-Stalinist Marxists or radical social democrats. On the other side, we've got Skerrit on the side of the constitution, on the side of democracy, either because they believed in it or because of strategy. We've got the Catalan left, Catalan nationalists. This is just Catalonia, by the way, not the whole of Spain. And we've got the pro-Soviet Communist Party. The pro-Soviet Communist Party are here because Stalin, and not here, which is a bit odd, because Stalin in 36 is in a difficult position, if you want. He's in between Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany. He's desperate for an agreement with Britain and France. So he's trying to prove to these countries he's not interested in a world revolution. So he's trying to get the local communists in Spain to tone down their rhetoric to not scare the Western democracies. It's a bit more complex than that, but that is the principal reason why the Communist Party is here and not where you might imagine it would be here. And of course, this very much surprises Orwell. And of course you have two communist parties, and they really didn't like each other. As I'm assuming everybody has read Homage to Catalonia, so I'm sure you all know that. And I'll come back to that. Okay. And you can see that this division between these two sides, which of course is very much about, in many ways, what Homage to Catalonia is about, writ large in Plaza Catalunya, in the square. This is Plaza Catalunya. So the Ramblers, those who don't know it, that's down there. Okay, I'm spinning it round. Here's the telephone exchange, and that's taken over. You all remember that from Homage Catalunya. That's taken over by the anarchists, the CNT, and it's not their headquarters, but it's very much a symbol of the power. Workers, not the Catalan government, not the American private company that owned it before, are controlling communications with the rest of the world. And of course, this is going to be very important in a few minutes, in a little bit later rather, in the May days. And on the other side, the whole Colon Hotel, which has been rebuilt since, actually it's not the same building, and that's taken over by the pro-Soviet Communist Party. And these two ideologies, and perhaps the pun is a little bit over here too, glaring each other across the square with their very different ideas about what is liberty. Okay, there we go. That is the old Colon Hotel with Stalin and Lenin there, and then across the way, this is a trading. I've got this actually. It's a little thing. It's funny. It's really lovely little. I think some of you've seen it before. And I don't know if there's people who've been on my tour, but if I have this, it's a little object. It's a trading card, an anarchist trading card, and you can see how the workers, and there would have been really some police here in reality too, defeating the military there. Okay, so the workers take over the rifle, they've got all these rifles, and then they go back to work, and they start to, in one sense, to spontaneously take over the workplaces. And over the next few weeks, something like 70% of Barcelona's business and industry is taken over by workers, and the term is collectivized. This is usually described as the greatest attempt at worker self-rule in world history. And unlike, for example, what happened in Russia, there's no overarching communist party taking control of this. It's very much about worker self-rule and local control. And it is spontaneous in one way, but in another way, it's not spontaneous at all, because the ideas behind anarchism were just steeped in the marrow of the working class. It was part of their culture in the 30s. And so that's in Plaza Catalunya. That's the Colon Hotel. This is a colorized photograph. George Orwell, of course, famously describes all the barbers as being anarchists. There it says, "At last we are free." This is the old Ritz Hotel, which is now the Palace, which was taken over by the Ritz workers themselves and turned into a workers' canteen. Hotel Gastronomic #1. We're in the Mediterranean, so any revolution is likely to be gastronomic. And the other aspect, which of course is very important to Orwell's experiences, which we're going to come back to in a moment, is of course the militias. And the context is the militias is, I'll explain this in a moment, but a third of Spain have fallen to Franco's side, including the city of Zaragoza in Aragon, to the west of Barcelona. And there's no army. The Spanish army's been disbanded because it's been disloyal by the Spanish government, against the Spanish Republican government, so that there's a military need. They don't have an army, you need militia, and that's what a militia is. And so these militias start to be developed. First it's the anarchists, then it's the communists, it's the Catalan nationalists, and as we'll see, it's also the POM. So these militias leaving Barcelona. This is the Lenin division, which of course Orwell is going to join very soon. Okay, and then he walked, and going back now to, so that was a sort of a little brackets about explaining the context of what Orwell, what hits him when he walks up the Ramblers and writes these famous words. Just to continuing from where I left off, waiters looked him in the face, treating him as an equal. And then he says, and he almost his first experience receiving a lecture from a hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. Which hotel? Well, it's the Continental. This is the entrance to the Continental. Today, it's a very small place, but back then it went way up to the Ramblers, but a very big hotel. So we kind of have to pretend it's not really quite the same hotel, but we can pretend. And he walks in there. Let's get the context of where we are. So that's Plaza Catalunya. We're in the Ramblers. And so he walks in there, or maybe it's in here, because as I say, it was a very big place then. And he's told off by the manager for tipping because they had famously repressed tipping. Okay, he then, that's just a few more words. And okay, so you know, he talks about all the revolutionary songs, all day and far into the night. He probably exaggerates this bit about well-dressed people at all. I think that's perhaps he's doing that perhaps for a British public, claiming that everybody's wearing overalls, everyone's got rough working class clothes. We know that's not absolutely true at all, because, for example, in the previous 1 month before, in the funeral of the famous anarchist Benaventura Durruti, when it's famously the biggest funeral in Spanish, in Barcelona history, 300,000 people go to this funeral. And there's lots of footage of this. You know, half the people are well dressed, and you know, a lot of the workers like to put on their Sunday best, and you know, and a lot of the anarchists were actually quite snappy dressers. So I think there's a little bit of an exaggeration here, which he's perhaps using it for. I don't know why he does this, but I certainly think we could perhaps criticise. But anyway, he's got this line, you know, all of this was queer and moving. There was much that I did not understand. And in, you know, this line, in some ways, I did not even like it. I recognise it as a state worth fighting for. And then he moves down the Ramblers to this building here. Well, I don't actually know if he does this before he goes to the Continental, but more or less the same time, which unfortunately no longer exists. So, okay. So this, look at these fiddly bits here, and look at this column here on the Ramblers. Sorry, just let me just show you. That's where the Continental is. Okay, we got that reference point, and then there's the column. So there's a column there, and there's the fiddly bits. And this is the Casa Lenin. So this was the international section of the pub, and it's where the ILP offices were. So this is where Eileen Blair later works here, of course. And he walks in here, and he meets, of course, John McNair, who's also claims in his diaries initially repelled by his old Etonian accent, but he finds out who he is. He's the famous writer Eric Blair. He's read his stuff. He admires him. He says, you'll be really useful for us as a course to write what's happening. He says, no, which is why we have to think, doubt about his real motives for coming. No, was it really journalism? Because he says straight away, according to McNair, no, I have come to fight against fascism. I know how to use a machine gun. And so they send him off to the Lenin barracks. But just before that, just a little bit of aside, nothing to do with Orwell, but the Casa Lenin. But here we've got this interesting juxtaposition of Mickey Mouse. We've got Vladimir and Mickey there. And we have to realize that Mickey Mouse was massive in Barcelona pre-war, and actually during the war on the Republican side. And it was also, we have to realize that Barcelona in 36 was actually quite a modern cosmopolitan city, which American mass culture very much arrived. Cinema was very popular, and in the rural areas of Spain, things were very, very poor, very, very often described as being medieval in some ways, but in the cities, particularly Barcelona, this was a pole of modernity, and this revolution actually takes place in a very modern city. There's quite an amusing quote by an American Trotskyist called Lois Orr, who sends back a series of very interesting letters to her mother and Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's, and she goes, I won't do an American accent, but she goes, there are things going on around here that would astonish any 100% American. One is the freeway, which the anarchist trade unions have adopted Popeye as their own pet mascot. In the little stands on the Ramblers, everywhere they sell little scarves and badges and statues of Popeye waving an anarchist flag of black and red. Betty Boop is also very much in favour amongst the anarchists, but Mickey Mouse, the idol of the people, is so popular, it is necessary that he be non-partisan. It's kind of fun words, but you might think it's a bit superficial, but I think it just reminds us, one, everyday life continues. Yeah, which, you know, always very good in those little bits about everyday life too. He's one of the best, because often, you know, local Catalan, Spanish authors at the time didn't necessarily go into the minutiae, because, you know, we you know, that's every day, so you don't need to talk about it, which is one of the reasons why Orwell's book's so good, because he's talking about really basic little things, which is what makes the reading of it so wonderful. Anyway, and two, as I say, to repeat myself, Barcelona was a modern cosmopolitan city in 1936. Okay, so John McNair sends him off to the Lenin barracks. Oh, where are we? So it's a bit confusing. So the Continental is around about here, and the Lenin barracks was down here. Anyone's got my book? No, sorry, apologies, it was here. Anyone's got my book? I got it wrong in the place. I said it was over here, and it's not, it's here. To the Lenin barracks, which is now the law courts. It's been completely demolished in the 1990s. There's nothing left. I really kicked myself when I take photographs of it. And there, this famous photograph is taken, which we'll just have a quick look at. And of course, there he is standing out from everybody else. And it's also, he describes in great detail, of course, in intimate detail, the Lenin barracks. And one of the phrases that always comes to mind with me is he says it smells of horse urine, because it was cavalry barracks. And that's one of the, you know, smell is something which pervades Homage to Catalonia, you know, usually unpleasant smells, you know, the excrement, etc. I don't know the author, I've not read it, but there's a book, of course, some of you may have read, called Orwell's Nose, and how Orwell uses the sense of smell of creating the time and the place. So, and then he has this joke training in the Lenin barracks, some rather comical scenes. And then, by the way, this photograph is taken by one of the greatest photographers of the Spanish Civil War, if not the greatest, the Catalan photographer Agustí Centelles. So there's Orwell, Agustí Centelles. That's his camera, so I don't know what that video is doing there. But of course, Centelles and Orwell never met. And then he goes off to the bus. He's taken off to the bus station. Apologies, not the bus station, the train station, Estació del Nord, which is today the bus station. And he takes his slow, rackety train to Catalonia, onto the High Meseta, he describes, of the Monegros, up here, Monthon, Barbastro. I think he's from here. He gets the, then he gets into a truck. They go close to Huesca, come down into Alcubierre. The temperature's dropping. God, I hate the cold. They almost get lost in the mist, and they arrive in La Sierra del Alcubierre. Just a point about Aragon was cleaved in two by the military coup of 36. The coup succeeds in most of Aragon up to about here. But the thing that changes this is that those militias from Barcelona, which is why I wanted to emphasize it, drive out, they pick up loads of people on the way, and they push back in the first few days and initially do really well and defeat several garrisons, small garrisons along the way. And then within a few days, set up the Aragon front, where Orwell's going to go. He's going to go around here, okay? And then Aragon is cleaved in two, between where the coup fails, which is here, and where the coup succeeds. And depending on what your politics were, you were left or right, whatever, and which side you were on, which side by accident you found yourself on, your experience of the war would have been radically different. Okay. And this bit I'm going to do really quick because, as I said, we're going to have to concentrate really on Barcelona, but he goes off to these, well, this is these trenches wonderfully recreated by Victor Pardo. Some of you, I'm sure, have been. These are the PUM positions. Orwell was probably slightly further along, but it doesn't really matter. The PUM, the enemies was over there, and it just goes in great detail there, so we won't go into that. He's also, Victor Pardo, been responsible for creating a wonderful little museum, which I hope to go to in a couple of weeks again, at Robres, which is, you know, about the militias, about Orwell, actually, it's a little bit as well. Well worth visiting. And then from he's two separate places, of course, in the Sierra del Corbiere, and then he goes 60 kilometers across the Plano de Sotomontaño, north 60 kilometers across the wintry plain up to here, which you can't see, the siege of Huesca. Now, Huesca was the town which was sieged on either side longest during the war by the Republicans. And they spent a year and a half trying to take Huesca and never did. So in that move from Catalonia into Aragon, but they never managed to take Huesca. So he sent up with the with his British comrades, who by now he's joined up with the ILP contingent. I mean, ILP contingent was very small, only 30 people or something. And they're with the PUM militia, and he ends up in this position here called La Granja, and he's involved with a few small engagements here, but he misses the big battle, which is going to come later. This is the Granja, which is famously described, and where's the chapel? I can't see it. But anyway, let's moving on. Just give you an idea that there's the Granja again with the siege, and this is a Francoist map of the because it says this is the red lines, yeah. So Orwell is basically operating around this area, but it's never taken. Just to say, some of you know, I think, the wonderful exhibition. Victor Pardo, the same person I mentioned before, did on George Orwell in Spain, called Orwell Has a Coffee in Huesca, jokingly referring to the Republican general who claimed the next day they were going, back in October, they were going to take Huesca, and they never do, and it becomes a standing joke in the army. And as a homage to this, and a wink to it as well, I suppose, Victor named his exhibition after that. And I'm sure some of you know that he's also at the moment involved in creating a memorial to this. This is the only photograph of Orwell in Huesca at the front, probably taken by George Kopp. Eileen's popped up with some supplies to see George there. She's arrived mid-February. She's now helping to run the ILP offices in Barcelona. The guy kneeling down here is Harry Milton, the American, probably his camera actually, who later, of course, saves Orwell's life. And while he's in Huesca, he's having lots of arguments with different members of the PUM about what they should do. Should they stay in this militia? There's nothing happening, which is, by the way, this is no longer a militia. I said that wrong. By March 37, in this photograph, he's now in the Republican Army. So even though they've got ragbag uniforms, they haven't got proper uniforms yet, they are now in the Spanish Republican Army. It's no longer a militia. And he's thinking this, you know, he wants to take part in what feels a proper battle, and he kind of has the idea of going to Madrid. And the only way of getting to Madrid is through the international brigades. To do so, you have to get permission from the Communist Party, and friends of his saying don't do it. But anyway, the whole contingent are given leave to go back to Barcelona for a week, and they all go back en masse. And they arrived back in Barcelona, all 30 of them, on the 26th of April, 1937, which is the same day, by the way, as Guernica was annihilated. Not that he knew that. He arrives in Barcelona and describes a city completely different than the one we saw before. The revolutionary euphoria has vanished, fights are breaking out, murders, we should say, on both sides of the table. And, you know, these tensions, these are just not going to last. And finally explodes. Well, it's going to explode in a couple of days. The letter Eileen Blair sends back to Orwell, to the family, saying she's feeding him, she's delousing him, feeding him with brandies and chocolate, arresting him in the hotel. He gets permission from a communist friend, whose name escapes me now, to join the International Brigade. So that's his plan. I don't think he actually joins. And the whole thing, but the city's this accident waiting to happen. And the whole thing kicks off on the 3rd of May, 1937, when the police, who are now more or less in communist hands, although perhaps it's just the Catalan government who want to control communications, understandably, try to take over the telephone exchange in Plaza Catalunya. The city is an accident waiting to happen, and these two sides emerge. It's that table. On the one side, it's the mass of the anarchist factory workers, the PUM, which is relatively small. On the other side, Catalan nationalists, the government, the Communist Party, and the police. And over the next few days, something like 400 people are killed on the streets of Barcelona. This terrible infighting. Now, always at the bottom of the Ramblers, at the Falcon Hotel, which is was the residency, foreign residency for the PUM members. Although he doesn't actually say sleeping there, we know from evidence he probably, I and George probably did sleep there. It's now a public library named after Andreu Nin, the leader of the PUM, by the way. And he hears the shooting, so he runs across the road to the Teatro Principal. Actually, this is the start of all these images, to pick up a rifle to defend the PUM. So he's not going to go to Madrid now. And let's just see where we are now today. So there's the Colon Hotel, not the Colon, sorry, the Falcon Hotel. That building hasn't changed, and neither has that one, the Principal Theatre. Let's just go back and just have a look at those two. You see the arches are the same, and those buildings are the same. Okay, those arches, and we can see there the arches. And he starts running up the Ramblers, hugging the buildings, trying to get to the PUM headquarters, which he knows he's being attacked. Barricades across the city. And he arrives here at the PUM headquarters, which is now a hotel. It's been rebuilt, actually. And the PUM headquarters is being threatened from this cafe, the famous Cafe Mocha, here, downstairs and also on the roof. So what they do is they send him and some of his comrades, including, by the way, Harry Milton, the American who saves his life later, into the Polyarma Theatre. They rush up onto the roof, up the spiral staircase. We couldn't go last time with the Orwell Society because it's still being restored. It's still covered in scaffolding, actually, Quentin. So they weren't making it up. And well, we've managed to get up there a few times, which is very moving to go on the roof there because you normally don't have permission. And he spends the next few days defending that building. I think we can probably see it better. Defending this building from the cafe. There's the Catalan police, the assault guards, who are facing off at Orwell, posing, pretending to face off at Orwell, it looks like in the photograph. Of course, there's not a shot here. There's a ceasefire. So he's up here in one of these, perhaps here or here, defending the building across the road. Because up in Plaza Catalunya, which is 1 minute that way, dozens of people were killed. Yeah, and this is where he describes a whole huge town of 1 million people locked in a violent inertia, a nightmare of noise without movement. Here and there along the Ramblers, the trams stood motionless, where the drivers jumped out of them. And all the while, the devilish noise of the fighting went on and on like a tropical rainstorm. And let me just show you get some of his time either in India or Burma. Anyway, I don't need to read that. So, but before you go, so and then after 5 days, I'll leave it there. After 5 days, the fighting stops. Compromise appears to be reached between the different groups. You see, there's 4 groups, and Orwell's disgusted by the whole thing, by both sides actually, but he's not a quitter, so he decides to go back to his old unit in Aragon. Before he does, he has some correspondence with Victor Goyans and writes his final note to the road to Wigan Pier, Gans's questions, and also sends a letter laying out his idea for a book about the Spanish War. Yeah, so that's the first sort of public notification that he's writing a book about the Spanish Civil War. Of course, when he's at the front, people around him, all his working class comrades, often complain that he was a bit of a scribbler. He was always writing. So clearly, he's obviously been doing quite a lot. We'll see where those notes are in a few minutes, or not. He goes back to Aragon, and on around the 10th of May, 1937, and on the 20th of May, he's shot through the neck by a sniper. Almost killed. Harry Milton jumps on him and managed to stop the wound. There's a great talk, which I watched again, actually, a couple of weeks ago, last week, an Orwell Society talk, which you can watch on YouTube if you haven't seen it. I strongly recommend that, with his son. Really interesting. What's his name? I can't remember his son's name. Yeah, I can't hear you, Quentin, but yeah. Anyway, this is a sketch that George Cott, Quentin's father, did to send to the family of the bullet wound going in. It's a question of millimeters that he saves his life, and he goes for a series of, first to a field station, and then to different hotels, hospitals, and then to a proper hospital at Lleida. And then from Lleida, he spends a few days resting there. There's a memorial there, which is quite nice, in the hospital gardens. And then from there, just to go back, he goes to Tarragona, and then finally into Barcelona, where he's cared for at the Sanatorio Maurin. Remind everyone that Maurin was the leader of the PUM. We saw it on the ILP ambulance sent by the ILP from Britain. The leader of the PUM, who was under a false identity in a Francoist prison and survives the war. The doctor there thinks he's going to lose his voice. He'll never speak again, but of course he does. But for the rest of his life, he speaks with a robotic voice. Although I believe there's no recording of Orwell, so we don't actually know what he sounds like. Anyway, after a few days, he's feeling a little bit better. Excuse me. He goes back. Of course, the war's over for him, so he goes back to the front to get his leave papers to leave Spain countersigned by his commanding officer in Huesca, and he comes back from there, back to the Sanatorio Maurin. He's got a bandaged neck. He comes in to see Eileen, walks into that hotel, the Continental. Eileen sees him. She goes up to him, big smile on her face. It was a big hotel lobby then. It wasn't quite small like this one then. Smiles, big smile on her face, puts her arm around him, hisses in his ear, "Get out." "What? Get out, quick, the police, they're looking for you. The PUM have been banned. Run." And Orwell runs out, and he spends the next few nights sleeping in bombed out buildings. He's now a fugitive from the Republican government he came to fight for. And after a few nights, Orwell and his wife, well, we'll come on to what happens to him. Yeah, the PUM have been banned, and I think that's in the wrong place. I'm gonna have to go back, put that in the wrong place. Apologies. Yeah, okay, no, right, I know what I've done now. I'm going to go back. We'll talk about Orwell escaping in a moment. The PUM have been banned. Why? Well, according to the Spanish government, they claim that they say the Catalan and Spanish governments, that the PUM have taken a really extreme position in the May Day fighting, which I think you can argue is quite true. And you can't do that during a war, and so they banned them for rebellion. But according to the Communist Party, as you can see in this poster, they go slightly further than that, and they claim that the PUM leaders are in actual fact secret Gestapo agents. And it says here, "Off with the mask," and of course you'll see the traitor Trotsky. And that's the American Communist Party newspaper in New York, Daily Worker, Spanish Trotskyist plot with Franco. And this is the really big thing for Orwell, because this is what shocks him as a writer. And this is a writer really centered for the rest of his life on totalitarianism, and leads him on a direct journey. Many people argue, I'm sure, to write 1984. And you see the seed of 1984. 1984, of course, is about lots and lots of different things. It's about press censorship in Britain. It's about the Soviet Union. It's about Nazi Germany. It's about his own personal issues. But the seed of it is the repression of the poem and the lies told about them in Barcelona by the Communist Party, and that how you can you tell a lie, you just tell it big. And actually, in homage to this, Tim Robbins, when he did a award-winning, excellent production actually on 1984 in 2010, at his insistence, the world premiere was at the Poliorama Theatre, which where Orwell was defending the poem from. I realise I'm running slightly out of time, so I'm going to miss out Andrea O'Neill. I'm going to move on. If we've got time, we will do. Of course, going back to Orwell, before they escape, he has this heroic attempt to try, even though he's risking his own, very likely to be arrested himself, trying to get George Kopp out of prison, who's been imprisoned. And of course, when you read Homage Catalonia, his commander, George Kopp, got to mention that. When you read Homage Catalonia, you believe he's dead. He's been killed in these prisons, but of course he survives. And Mark did this very good short book on the story of George Kopp and how he escapes and his adventures afterwards and before as well. And then, of course, there's the tragic story of Bob Smiley, his comrade from Aragon, who dies under very suspicious circumstances in a prison in Valencia. We'll have to miss that out today as well. And right, so back onto Orwell. Eileen, George, Stafford Cotman, another comrade, and John McNair. They all go down to the magnificent Station de França, which is here, and they get the train posing as tourists. They cross the border more or less without incident into Bagnols-sur-Mer. And it's while they're in Bagnols-sur-Mer, they're reflecting back on this. Is this in Homage or one of the right letter? I can't remember one of the later essays. They're reflecting back at it. We always had the time when you were in Spain, you felt that you were being spied upon. And of course, he was being spied upon by a character called David Cook, a British communist who'd been in the International Brigade, who'd been wounded at the Battle of Jarama. He was inducted into the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, and he was spying on George Orwell at Hotel Catalan. And he was also, not Hotel Continental, sorry, and he was also spying on George Kopp pretending to be a prisoner in the prison where George Kopp was kept. Also, something just to finish, we missed out, is that while Orwell was hiding out for those 3 days in Barcelona, the police, the official police, raid Eileen Blair's hotel room in the Continental, and they don't take the passports. She sits on them, and they decide they don't go near her. But they do take all of his papers, his photographs, and crucially his notes, which you could perhaps say is the draft copy of Homage to Catalonia, or close to. And then they disappear. And where are they? Well, being a foreign suspect Marxist, because he was accused of being Trotskyist by the Spanish secret police, they would have passed them on to the Spanish secret police, and from there, Spanish secret police would almost certainly have passed them on to the NKVD. And there are very, very strong evidence, and several people have claimed to have seen this, that they are currently in the Lubyanka or the Moscow records in Moscow. And one day they will appear. And there's more things I could say, but I'm a bit worried about the time. So I kind of really rush things and miss things out. But how we do for time? Is it time for questions, or shall I carry on?
Well, I should carry on for another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So gets back to England. He writes Homage to Catalonia basically from memory, because he's lost all of this, lost of all of his notes. I'm sure Eileen helps him a lot. He only ever mentions her as my wife in his book. And he was certainly a man of his times in that sense. I think she helps to type it out. his old publisher Goyance doesn't want to touch it because it has this uncomfortable message of the presence of the Communist Party in Spain, the role of the Soviets in Spain, and the other left publishers, centre-left publishers, don't want to publish because they don't want to rock the Republican government. Perhaps his message is too complex for the late 30s, and it's this small, finally it's this small outfit publishes it. And it doesn't sell out. I think the 1,500 copies, 400 of which end up being remaindered until after his death in 1951. And it's really only since the 60s, really, when people start to read Homage to Catalonia again. Of course, it's been published all around the world. Quentin was talking about this new Icelandic edition, which I'd love to get a copy of that. I've got about 20. These aren't mine, but I do have about 24 language editions, which we have on permanent display in the Cafe Mocha. If you ever go down there, you can see them for yourselves. And then, of course, what was Orwell's politics? So I don't want to go too much into that because we wouldn't have time. But there's a very famous line, though, he writes in Why I Write, which I think sums up really what Orwell's politics were, and certainly were when it came to after he came to Spain. Because I think it's not that Orwell. It's not that Homage to Catalonia makes Orwell more or less left wing. I think it just makes him more firm in his convictions that he's a democratic socialist. Yeah. And this famous line, every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. And, there was an article in the New York Times 2 years ago, and I really wish I'd kept this because I haven't been able to find it again. A New York Times article writing about Trump, actually, but he quoted this line, and he missed out the last 4 words, which I think is a bit Orwellian itself. So you'd say Orwell will still be used and abused. Land and Freedom, of course, is Ken Loach's attempt to remake Homage to Catalonia, because Loach tries to get the rights for Homage to Catalonia and for various reasons couldn't. No one's ever made it. So he retells it very, very, very loosely through the story of his Orwell's comrade, Stafford Copman. Of course, there's some criticisms you can make of Land and Freedom. At the same time, it's a very moving film. The Catalan and Spanish editions of Homage to Catalonia, interestingly, were first brought out in 1969 during the Francoist dictatorship. I suppose it was because things were slightly liberalizing in the late 60s, but also it was a way of attacking the Communist Party, I think. And curiously, it first came out in Catalan a few months before in Spanish. So perhaps to test the waters, see what happens. We'll put it out in Catalan, not many will buy it, see what happens. And it is, I wouldn't say it's heavily censored, but it is censored. For example, every time George Orwell uses the word fascist, the censor changes it to nationalist. Now, some years ago, it's about 10 years ago now, a very good Spanish edition came out with a proper translation by Debate, which correctly uses the Orwell text and the Peter Davison order of the chapters. But the Catalan edition, a correct uncensored Catalan edition, didn't come out. Please, didn't come out. And I have this children issue for a moment. I'm going to sort that one out in a moment. Didn't come out until last week. So we've not had a proper Catalan edition. Can you get rid of that? Excuse me. Most interesting thing that's happened for an hour. There wasn't a proper Catalan edition based on the 80s text and uncensored until last week, which is great that that's come out. And hey, look, I want to finish with this last line of the book because I just think it's so powerful. And unfortunately, I don't see it all. Okay, I think it's just such a way to end the book. Comes back from France, passes through Paris. They don't bother visiting the Paris World Fair, where Guernica is on display, actually, curiously enough. And they arrive into England. And then England, southern England, probably the sleekest landscape in the world. It is difficult when you pass this way, especially when you are peacefully recovering from seasickness with the plush cushions of the boat carriage underneath you to believe that anything is really happening anywhere. Earthquakes in Japan, famines in China, revolutions in Mexico. Oh, don't worry, the milk will still be on the doorstep tomorrow morning. The new statesman will come out on Friday. The industrial towns were far away, as smudge of smoke and misery hidden by the curve of the earth's surface. Down here, it was still the England I had known in my childhood, the railway cuttings smothered with wildflowers, the deep meadows where the great shining horses browse and meditate, the slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosoms of the elms, the larkspurs in the cottage gardens, and then the huge, peaceful wilderness of outer London. The barges on the miry river, the familiar streets, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue policemen, all sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, from which I sometimes fear that we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs. What an absolutely brilliant way to end his book. Anyway, thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. I'm sure everybody found that as interesting as I did. A couple of things to pick up from what you said. Harry's son is David Milton.
David, that's right, David, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That's been a great evening. If everybody would like to unmute themselves and give your appreciation for Nick's contribution tonight.
There's some lovely comments there from everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much for all your comments.
Next month, as I say, it's Peter talking about his new book.
I will certainly be watching that, Peter. I'll have to actually watch it on YouTube. It's difficult for me to watch them live. I'll watch all of them.
And our next Orwell Society visit to Spain will be mid-May 2024. So get your fingers on the buzzers.
I will try to attend. Have to come back.
Thanks so much to Chris and Quentin for organising that.
Cheers then. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.